So now we jump to the last talk, and I believe we close the symposium with Golden Key. I'm very pleased and honored to present you our last speaker, even though Michael Chase would not need any presentation at all. I think I speak for all when I say that we are extremely grateful and indebted to you for the outstanding work you have done in translating Pierre Hadot's major works, and I believe even this event in English wouldn't be possible, or at least would be made a lot more complicated if without your work. So first of all, thank you so much for that, and of course for being here and having been so active in all the discussions. We do appreciate it. So I will nevertheless introduce him because it is my obligation as moderator. So Michael Chase is senior researcher at the Center Jean Pépin on the CNRS, National Center of Scientific Research in Paris, France. He is currently visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin. He works at the intersection of Greek, Arabic, and Latin philosophy and has published widely on ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, Greek and Latin patristics, medieval Latin and Arabic philosophy, as well as parallels between pre-modern and contemporary science. He was a student of Pierre Hadot, and as I already mentioned, he has translated a half dozen of Hadot's books into English. He is also co-founder and co-editor with Matthew Sharpe and Kramer of the new series by Brill, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies. And in addition to North America and Europe, he has been invited to lecture or teach in Japan, Iran, Brazil, and Russia. And today he's going to give us a talk on Pierre Hadot and his critics on spiritual exercises and cosmic consciousness. So the floor is yours, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Marta and Hélder. Thank you both for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience. I've learned a lot. I'm going to try to share my screen and bestow upon you a PowerPoint. Let me see how this works. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Let me go back to the beginning. Okay then. Pierre Hadot and his critics on ancient spiritual exercises and cosmic consciousness. Now, of course, a lot of the ground that I was going to speak of has already been covered, so I'm sure I'll be able to skip quite a bit of material. My introduction is on religion, mysticism, and philosophy. So, as we've seen again and again over these proceedings for Hadot, the ultimate goal of philosophy is self-transformation, which is achieved by a gradual process of perfecting oneself by means of transforming the way that we look on the world. And this process culminates in a new way of seeing, but not just in a new way of seeing, but in a new way of existence, a new way of being, in which we can be more intensely. And this is roundabout where philosophers of the analytic tradition start to get a little nervous. As we've seen, thanks to Marta's luminous presentation on Cooper's objections and other contributions, several people are unhappy with Hadot's views. It has been seen by Cooper as mystical or religious rather than philosophical. Other commentators, like Pierre Vesperini, claim that Hadot's tendency to frame this goal in terms of seeing things in accord with the objective spirit or the universal reason confirms that he is a crypto-Hegelian, although he virtually never mentions Hegel in any of his writings. Well, finally, and this is the view of someone like John Sellers in some recent works, according to these commentators, we have here a relic of Hadot's training as a priest and his lifelong interest in all manifestations of mysticism and his own personal mystical experiences. Well, I think all these views have been dealt with pretty adequately in the sessions we've seen so far. I just want to put my cards on the table, state my assumptions. I believe that the borderline between religion, mysticism, and philosophy are not as easy to draw as commonly supposed. All three terms, as Marta has pointed out, are ill-defined, although scholars have a tendency to write as though everyone knows precisely what we all mean by these terms. as is well known. It's a common term of abuse or a way of dismissing someone else's position to just say, oh, that's just mysticism. We find that very often in the hard sciences. And sometimes it seems that what is at stake in these debates transcends pure rationality. Some scholars have a deep-seated aversion to everything that smacks of mysticism and ardently defend the philosophers they study against accusations of mysticism, presumably on the grounds that if their objects of study were convicted of mysticism, they would ipso facto no longer be worthy of study. Now, I want to, following the works of Michel Hulin and others, I want to argue, or rather assume, that mysticism, something corresponding to the mystical experience, does exist cross-culturally, and it includes some or all of the following features: a feeling of the unity of all reality with the consequent dimming or extinction of the difference between subject and object, a diminution of the sense of the importance or substantiality of one's own ego-centered individuality, a diminution of feelings of fear, anxiety, and depression, a correlated feeling of deep empathy for all living beings and perhaps even for inanimate nature. And these, I think, are reflected in what has been often described, Pierre Hadot's account of his own expérience océanique. So what I want to consider here is the more specific case of Hadot's concept of cosmic consciousness. Is cosmic consciousness a mystical experience? Another question I will address is how it can be achieved. And finally, if I have time, I will talk about what some of its neural correlates may be. All right, so what is cosmic consciousness? Well, Hadot has various formulations. He speaks of transcending the limits of individuality to recognize oneself as part of a cosmos animated by reason, the awareness of being part of the cosmos, the expansion of the ego into the infinity of universal nature. He speaks of becoming aware of the place of one's individual existence within the great current of the cosmos in the perspective of the whole. And as we've seen before, he characterizes philosophy as a whole in antiquity as the effort to liberate oneself from the partial, passionate viewpoint linked to the body and the senses, and to rise up to the universal, normative viewpoint of thought, to submit oneself to the demands of the logos and the norm of the good. Now, I think that one thing we haven't talked about so far is this notion of the daimon, which we find throughout early Greek philosophy, as early perhaps as Pythagoras. Now, in Hadot's work, he understands the daimon as a kind of a higher, more authentic self, by which we can somehow identify by means of spiritual exercises. And when he talks about this, his evidence in the text that he cites include the Timaeus of Plato, where we read that God has given each person a daimon theos, a god or a daimon that dwells in the summit of our body. And happiness, in Greek eudaimonia, simply means keeping that inner daimon in a state of good order. Hadot also cites in this context the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, and Metaphysics Lamba of Aristotle, where Aristotle writes that what is most divine within us, the intellect, at the same time transcends us. And we can also compare a text like the Letters of Lucilius from Seneca, who writes that a sacred spirit, spiritus in Latin, which corresponds to the Greek daimon, is within us, the observer and guardian of all our good and evil acts. He gives magnificent, upright advice. Now, in Stoicism, this remains a very important concept. Epictetus says, yet he, that is to say God, has stationed by each individual's side as guardian his particular daimon, and has committed the individual to his care. He is a guardian who never sleeps, and so on. And it's also a very prominent concept in Marcus Aurelius, which I think questions Christopher Gill's idea that the self is always relational. Well, here the relation is not to another person, it seems to be to something supernatural. Live with the gods, Marcus says, but he is living with the gods who continuously shows that his soul is satisfied with the things that have been allotted. And in doing what the daimon, the portion of himself which Zeus has given to each man to guard and guide him, will. And this daimon is each man's intellect and reason, nous and logos. Now, This in turn makes me want to speak a little bit about the theme that I'm going to call On Becoming What We Are. It goes back as far in Greek literature as Pindar, who writes, "Become such as you are, having learned what that is, gene hoios estimaton." And then someone like Seneca, who writes that how contemptible a thing is man, unless he rises above what is human. And even a contemporary 20th century figure, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, the student and collaborator of Heisenberg, who writes that in general, through meditation, one does not become anyone else, but one becomes the person one has always been. Now, Christoph Horn has written some very interesting material along these lines. He writes that in all approaches of classical ancient ethics, all these approaches are perfectionist in the sense of a species-based essentialism. And he speaks of a normative naturalism of ancient ethics as, quote unquote, always understood as objective and perfectionistic. That is, in the sense of a become what you are model of essentialism. Now, I take this to mean a couple of theses. I take it to mean that ancient ethics agrees, first of all, that the human species has a universal and changing essence, usually envisaged as identical to reason, as in Stoicism, on Hadot's interpretation. And secondly, that the goal of this ethics is to identify oneself or realize one's identity with this rational essence. In Platonism, says Christoph Horn, this takes place by what he calls self-objectification, or the abandonment of one's individual characteristics or one's de facto individuality in favor of a normative personality, usually conceived as de-individualized. Now, another figure I want to briefly mention is Pierre Hadot, who has written an article in a very interesting book called Buddhist Spiritual Practices, Thinking with Pierre Hadot on Buddhism, Philosophy, and the Path. Now, Hadot's arguments, I have a lot of problems with most of them, but I think he points out two very important points. He points out, first of all, that Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises is loose. And he asks the question, what precisely qualifies an activity to be called a spiritual exercise from henceforth SE? Then Hadot proposes a distinction between what he calls top-down exercises, which consist in applying rules or principles already accepted, and bottom-up exercises, which he says accumulate experiences to effectuate a transformation. So I'm going to propose my own tentative definition of a spiritual exercise. I want to argue that a spiritual exercise depends not so much as on the nature of the activity envisaged, as on the way it is undertaken, with what attitude and method, and with a view to which goal. It seems to me that all spiritual exercises require complete attention to and focus on an activity, and they imply that we immerse ourselves so completely in the matter at hand that we forget ourselves, much like what Gianfranco has referred to as a flow experience. However, and I think this is crucial, a spiritual exercise is not just any kind of a flow experience, but it's an activity in which one engages with the intent of carrying out some kind of transformative action upon oneself. Now, Marta's analyses and classification of spiritual exercise was extremely illuminating. I'm going to briefly present another one, which is proposed by Christoph Horn in his book Antike Lebenskunst. Horn argues that the main distinction between these two, between spiritual exercises, is between what he calls spiritual exercises intended for concentration and self-development, and on the other hand, those intended for self-renunciation. Now, I'm not going to pause over all the details of this, and I know it's kind of hard to see because it's small. I had to try to fit everything on the screen. The basic division that we should notice is the first one, up on the very top row, between exercises for concentration and self-development and exercises for what Horn calls for self-renunciation, which implies the identification of the self and the concept, cosmos. Now, what I really want, the only thing I want to point out here, I won't have time to go into all of these, is that while the left-hand side of this diaresis is extremely developed, subdivided into exercises that are therapeutic, sensibilizing, moral, intellectual, and spiritual, The right-hand side for self-renunciation is hardly developed at all. In fact, it seems somewhat perfunctory. He spends about half a page mentioning that such exercises include the look from above and things like that. He doesn't subdivide it any further at all, whereas he divides the other branch into 5 different branches. My second sort of hesitation with regard to Horn's very interesting analysis is the question of, can one really describe such exercises as exercises of self-renunciation? Hadot, as far as I recall, never uses that terminology, but instead instead of renunciation, he speaks of self-transcendence, dépassement in French. Most importantly, what I want to argue, and this is probably the key point of my whole presentation, is that for Hadot, it's not so much the self that one is supposed to renounce or transcend, but it is what we erroneously identify as ourself. So what I get from Hadot is that our usual assumption, if we're asked what our self is, we'll answer that the self is what presents itself to our immediate introspection. It's that set of thoughts, emotions, memories, beliefs, tendencies, characteristics, and so on, which we identify as ours. And I would say it has at least 2 main characteristics. One is that it's egocentric. It tends to evaluate things and events in terms of our own likes, dislikes, hopes, and fears. And some of these tendencies are necessarily of extraneous origin. They can be conveyed to us, imposed upon us by our upbringing, education, by more and more today by the media, etc., etc. Secondly, this, what I could call the default version of the self, is characterized by a feeling of isolation. The self seems to us to end where the boundaries of our body ends. We are, we think, each of us alone within a society and a universe which are at best indifferent to our interests and at worst actively hostile. Now, Hadot, I think, wants to argue that this view is simply mistaken. It is one of main source of the feelings of loneliness and despair that increasingly characterize people today. If we fear death, failure, illness, rejection, being laughed at, not being sufficiently attractive, and so forth, all these fears apply to this default individualized, isolated self. However, for Hadot, this is not the real self. There is a higher, less egocentric self, which, as we've seen, is sometimes identified in the tradition with the Platonic daimon, a self which is constantly aware of its intimate connection with other human beings, with nature, and with the entire cosmos. It has a global, universal perspective, and it considers the forest, not the trees. And the self, this self that has realized and constantly realizes its unity with the cosmos, can accede to a viewpoint, according to Hadot, that is universal and objective. It sees reality as it truly is. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that I think that Hadot's description of spiritual exercises is absolutely perfect, that it cannot be improved upon. For one thing, I think that there is an apparent tension between 2 aspects of spiritual exercises, according to Hadot. Some of these exercises seem to be based on intense concentration on the self. Others seem to be based on or have the goal of the dissolution, renunciation, or, as I would prefer to say, the transcendence of the self. And I want to suggest that a possible solution of this dilemma is that there may be a progression from stage A to stage B, in which the practitioner begins by concentrating on herself. Once she has discovered the traces of her true self by means of for instance, the lesson taught in the first Alcibiades between on how to distinguish between what we have and what we are. Once the traces of this nucleus of the true self have been determined, the practitioner then ascends to identify herself with the transcendent self, the capital S, that is to say, with the inner daimon. And this may be what Hadot means by identifying oneself with the spirit or with objective reason. So, in other words, Hadot says that when we first introspect and ask ourselves what we are, our everyday self is only the first step. By true observation, distinguishing what we have from what we are, we can catch a glimpse of the fact that there is a kernel within us of something more basic and essential. And that, according to Hadot, is, following the Stoics, reason. It's the logos, otherwise known as the daimon. Then, once we've glimpsed this nucleus, we can follow methods akin to those of the symposium of Plato, and we can gradually rise up to identify with an objective reason that is no longer distorted by our individual passions and egocentric interests. Now, in what sense does Hadot say that this reason is objective? Well, first of all, it's maximally free from the distorting influences of subjectivity, otherwise known as our passions, which always grant priority to what we perceive as our own short-term egocentric interests. And this reason is objective also in the sense that it enables us to see the world as it really is in and for itself, no longer as a mere function of our individual wants and desires. And I think that this is probably what it means for Hadot to achieve cosmic consciousness, to see the world and our place within it as they really are. Now, I'm going to get very speculative here and suggest some parallels on the one hand with Buddhism and the other hand with neuroscience. In some schools of Buddhist meditation and mindfulness meditation, which derives from it, there is a distinction between two separate types of meditation. One is called concentrative or convergent. It takes place when one begins meditating by concentrating on a mantra or on a specific spot on the wall or on one's breath and so forth. Its characteristics are that it is focused, voluntary, top-down, and egocentric. The faculties involved are short-term memory and the dorsal attention stream. We'll see what that means in just a few seconds. The goal of this initial stage is to quiet the incessant mental chatter that is almost always filling up our brains, what the Buddhists call monkey mind. And its goal can be a state of absorption, samadhi here. And one thinks of the anecdote mentioned by Pierre Hadot in the symposium of Plato, where Socrates spends 24 hours motionless, glued to the spot and apparently lost in something like, it looks like it might have been some kind of meditation. The second kind of major kind of meditation in Buddhism is receptive and divergent. This is one, after this initial stage of concentration, one opens oneself up to hearing sounds and seeing sights from the outside world. Its characteristics, in contrast to the first stage, are that it's open, bottom-up, reflexive, subconscious, and allocentric, that is to say, other-oriented. And the faculties involved are the long-term intuitive faculties and the ventral attention stream. Once again, we'll briefly come to see what that means. Now, in Zen Buddhism, it's held that the balanced and judicious alternation of these two processes can lead to a state of kensho, in Japanese, which is a brief experience of insight into the world such as it really is. Experience of the world as just this, thusness, or suchness. Now, a little bit of neurophysiology here, not too much. What I really want to focus on here is the fact that there are two basic attentional streams. We have the one, both of them start off in the occipital realm at the back of the skull, and the visual and auditive streams here, there is one of them that starts from the bottom and then goes towards the top of the brain, and that is the concentrated top-down egocentric stream. It has to do with, more specifically, it has to do with the position of objects in relation to us. And in that sense, it's egocentric. What does this object mean to me? The other one, which is known as the ventral stream, of course, begins in the same occipital cortex, but progresses lower along the brain through the temporal cortex. And that is a more allocentric stream in the sense that its function is to ask questions about things that we see and hear independently of their relation to us. So in that sense, it can be said to be allocentric or other-oriented. Now, an interesting point that's been brought to light by the Buddhist and neuroscientist James Austin is that when you look at the parts of the brain that are metabolically active all the time, even when we're asleep, these are the ones that are in dark colors here. You notice and you compare this location of this metabolic, this default state, it's been called, which some neuroscientists have identified with the physical seat of our notion of the self. What we notice is, I'm afraid the arrows are very hard to see, but these two attentional streams, the dorsal one starts off with the occipital stream and then runs right into this metabolically active area. Whereas the ventral attentional stream courses south of it and stays away from this metabolically active default area, which, as I say, has been identified as the locus of our notion of ourself. So, James Austin, who cites all these data, argues that by gradually quieting the chattering, word-oriented, self-centered dorsal attentional network and activating the pre-linguistic, bottom-up, allocentric, ventral attention stream, we may facilitate access to a peak experience that is deeper and more transformative than the mere internal absorptions, a la Socrates in the symposium, that can be triggered by focused attention alone. And Austin, when he's describing the peak experience of Kensho, writes of, and I quote, it writes of the fact that it combines the total absence of the old psychic self with the stunning realization of co-identity with the world. And I don't think we could come up with a better description of what Hadot means by cosmic consciousness than this stunning realization of our co-identity with the world. So, it seems to me that what I find very interesting is that there's no reason to believe that Hadot and Austin ever knew of each other's existence. They never read each other's books. However, they come up with some descriptions of this, this peak experience, this mystical experience, for lack of a better term, that are remarkably similar. And it seems to me that this convergence implies that they might be on to something true. So, on this hypothesis, cosmic consciousness, attested in Greco-Roman thought, Zen Buddhism, and elsewhere, would not be, despite what critics have claimed, an alien element which Hadot anachronistically projected upon early Greco-Roman philosophy because of his Catholic or Neoplatonic tendencies, as Sellers has argued. But, as Austin has shown, such peak experiences may be more or less cross-culturally and universally attested because they result from physiological features of the brain and the central nervous system shared by all human beings. Now, in conclusion, I just want to look at another interesting point of conversion between Hadot and Austin, which is that they, once again, in complete independence, cite the same text by Einstein. And it's one of Hadot's favorite texts. He charged me to track down the origin of it, and I eventually succeeded. It goes that a human being is a part of a whole called by us universe, a part limited in space and time. He experiences himself, his thoughts, and his feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of the consciousness. This delusion is a kind of a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affections for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole nature, a whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievements is in itself part of the liberation and a foundation for inner security. So that's Einstein. Now, what are both Hadot and James Austin cite these texts, but they interpret it quite differently. For Hadot, Einstein's words allow us to see, and I quote, the intimate connection between, on the one hand, the passage from partial vision to a universal vision, and on the other, an awareness of the duty to put oneself in the service of the human community. James Austin, for his part, as a scientist, cites scientific studies on Einstein's brain, which suggests that Einstein's extraordinary cognitive skills could have represented contributions merging from both sides of the brain, especially posteriorly. So it seems to me that while Hadot's exegesis in this case may seem to be excessively speculative, and Austin's may seem to be excessively reductionist, it may be possible to combine the two. Taken in conjunction, the approaches of Austin and Hadot can, I hope, complement and reinforce one another, opening up the prospect of an exciting research program in which Hadot's views on PWL in general and spiritual exercises in particular might be investigated from the viewpoint of neurophysiology and perhaps illuminatingly compared with analogous doctrines and experiences attested in Buddhism and other non-Western cultural traditions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael, for such a terrific presentation. I believe you gave us much food for thought. And happily, we have 25 minutes, 30 minutes maybe for questions. I give the word to Hélder, Telo, and then Ani, Larivée. If somebody else wants to speak, please raise your hand because we are going together for set of questions as usual. Hélder.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very interesting and stimulating presentation. I found it fascinating, these new doors that this approach to spiritual exercises by comparing it with neurophysiology offers us. It gave me a lot to think. So I was very perplexed with what you said at the beginning, that we could see a great resemblance between cosmic consciousness and mystical experience. And I was thinking about the fact that cosmic consciousness seems to depend intrinsically on logos, and any concept of mysticism, I think, would somehow oppose it. But then when you entered in the analysis of neurophysiology, I understood how they can be very, very closely related. So my first question is if I understood this correctly. So they are very similar because the neurophysiological component, even if they can be described in very different ways, or would you go further than this and say that their similarity is more than neurophysiological? And a second question concerns this notion of objective reason. So I find it very plausible in the context of Stoicism, but I was wondering if it can be applied to other philosophical schools, systems, ways of life, and not only in Hellenism, but even Plato and Aristotle, because it seems to fit very well with Stoicism. But I'm not sure if it fits as well with other philosophers, especially those that have a more skeptic component. So certain interpretations of Plato, Socrates, the figure of Socrates, skepticism, Epicureanism. So I was wondering about the potential of this notion of objective reason for the description of the whole ancient philosophy, or the authors we are normally concerned in the context of Hadot. And for the spiritual exercises in general, not only Stoic spiritual exercises.
Okay.
Annie?
Thank you. I apologize in advance. I'm afraid my question will be a bit chaotic. I don't know how to organize my thoughts because it was so rich. But if the cosmic consciousness can be explained or understood in the neurological terms that you used, I'm wondering, and I think of ancient philosophers like Plotinus, and I would have to remember all the adjectives or all the features that you added in your description of cosmic consciousness. But the feeling of immersion, of flow, not being separated from the world, that type of experience. So I'm thinking of ancient philosophers who worked very hard to get there. Plotinus in particular, who says that he reached that state of unity twice, I think. You know that better than me, but perhaps a couple of times in his whole existence. He worked to get this very, very hard. The spiritual exercises were performed, but still the achievement of this state of consciousness were extremely rare. And now I'm wondering, you know, and I hope you won't find, or you won't think that I'm joking. I'm not. What if we can just take a chemical, a drug, and reach that type of, or experience that type of cosmic consciousness? There's a lot of serious research is done currently on ketamine, for example, that supposedly leads you there. You just take it and you're there. You don't have to perform these spiritual exercises for decades, hoping that it will happen. You take it, you're there. So I'm not sure what my question here is, but I wonder, why would philosophy be necessary if this is what the goal is?
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your wonderful presentation. Very clear, very interesting, and combining what, at least for me, were two different worlds. But to my question now, my question has to do with the concept of diamond, which is a pivotal aspect of your presentation, and it actually it corresponds to sort of a point of departure of yours in what you were trying to demonstrate at the very at least at the very beginning of the paper. And my question is, well, the diamond is of course something in us, but it's something divine in us. I don't think we can dissociate the notion of diamond from the notion of divinity. And in this sense, since this notion is sort of point of departure of your presentation, my question is, can we speak of is it possible to speak of cosmic consciousness without speaking about divinity, even if it is the divinity of reason? I don't know. This is my first question. The other question is more, it's more simple, I think. How could we relate the notion of cosmic consciousness with, for example, something that we can find in other authors, for instance, Nietzsche or Heidegger, in the case of Nietzsche with the Dionysiac experience, and in the case of Heidegger with the notion of the Augenblick, the moment of vision. So these are my two questions. Thanks, Michael, again, and thank you all. If I don't have the opportunity to say goodbye, this has been a wonderful encounter. So thank you.
Thank you. Following the methodology we have been adopting thus far, I will give the word now to Gianfranco, because we are giving priority to the speakers, and then I will ask for a second round of questions with the others, but I will not forget you. Gianfranco.
So thank you very much, Professor Chase. I want to recall this relation that you made between or among cosmic consciousness, mysticism, and a topic that somehow was placed that is the alterated state of consciousness. Through your presented project of a neurophysiological approach to spiritual exercise, do you think that we could include the alterated states of consciousness in the spiritual exercise, or in the notion of a spiritual exercise? Well, I read, for instance, that the same Hadot speaks about the Dionysiac estase as a form of spiritual, of cosmic consciousness. Apropos, he was speaking about Nietzsche, of course, and he stresses how the Dionysiac extase could be included precisely in this cosmic consciousness. So my question is if we can include, for instance, experiences as the Georges Bataille or the Benjamin described in his journal on Ashish as forms of or attempts to reach through alterations of consciousness this cosmic consciousness you are referring about. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, it seems that I'm going to try, I think, to answer Annie's and Gianfranco's questions together because I think they're closely related. And I think that they boil down to, well, okay, cosmic consciousness, mystical experience. What is their relation to altered states of consciousness produced by other means, in particular by drugs? Obviously, Hadot doesn't have anything to say on that, but James Austin, who wrote 5 huge books between 500 and 1,000 pages each, goes into that in a great deal of detail, and he thoroughly he comes down very hard and states in no uncertain terms that the psychedelic experiences produced by drugs may be phenomenologically similar, but they do not have the same effects. If you want to have an effect, one of these experiences that is going to be lasting in the sense that it transforms your subsequent behavior, your subsequent psychic state, then you have to work for it. In Zen monasteries, of course, people spend 20, 30, 40 years in an attempt to experience one of these things. James Austin himself drew up a list of 7 different states, different degrees of this kind of experience, and he himself, after 50 years of practice, only arrived at number 6. And he mentioned how rare these experiences were for Plotinus. But I think Plotinus would be of the same view, that if you don't have to work for it, that was the sense of his debate with the Gnostics, basically. The Gnostics were of the same view. They didn't have LSD. I presume if they did, they would have taken it because they thought, let's just take a shortcut. Let's get up there. Let's use magical formulae, get up to this state of altered consciousness as quickly as possible, and then we don't have to read all those boring books of philosophy. But Plotinus and the whole Neoplatonic and the whole Greek tradition, I think, said, no, you need to work at this. You need to prepare yourself through hard work, generally speaking, through the study of logic, first of all, and then not neglecting the study of ethics and physics either. This kind of experience is something that has to be worked for, prepared for, because otherwise it can be dangerous. And in any rate, the experience you have, if you take a shortcut, is just not going to be as lasting and as beneficial. So I hope that more or less argues both of your questions. Let me go back to Hélder then, if I may. Hélder, you said, is the similarity merely based on neurophysiology, or is there something more to that? I'm agnostic on that point. I have no idea. I can point out the fact that I would explain similar experiences by similar neurophysiology, but I don't want to be reductionist. It could be that similar neurophysiological experiences is all there is. It could be that they gave us access to an objectively real, to objective reality. I'm agnostic on that. Your second question was, let me see here. Yes, is objective reason a description of the whole of philosophy? Absolutely not.
Ancient philosophy, I meant.
Not ancient philosophy at all. No. As Pierre Hadot is quite right that, in my view, it's reason is one aspect and no more, and that's, you know, as we see in the spiritual exercise, in the triple discipline of Marcus Aurelius, the training of the intellect is a very important part. It's connected with the discipline of assent, and it's an absolutely necessary part. But so is the discipline of desire, which trains the will and the imagination. So is ethics, which trains our relations to others. So by no means, I do not believe that objective reason is at all sufficient unto itself in ancient philosophy or anywhere else.
Okay, but my question was different from that, was whether objective reason could also be applied to other schools or other systems, other philosophies in antiquity other than Stoicism, because it seems to apply very well to Stoicism. But I'm not sure if it applies, for instance, to a Socratic way of life.
Oh, I think certainly one of the many meanings of the logos that's invoked constantly by Socrates is what would correspond to objective reason, but it's not all that reason is, as you mentioned. Plato often talks, and the task of separating off what Plato makes Socrates says and what Socrates really believed is virtually impossible, I think. But certainly Plato talks of the logos in organic terms as being something that's really alive. It is something to which we have to yield. It is something that rules and the discourse and orients the direction of the discourse. And rather than us carrying out rational argumentation, as Cooper maintains, what Plato says is we have to let the logos, we have to obey the logos and let it guide us where it will. That's how we'll find the truth. Okay. It's not rational argumentation. That's not rational argumentation in any sense with which we're familiar, I don't think.
Yes, thank you.
We can have now a second round of questions.
I'm not sure that I've answered Paul
sorry, Michael.
yet.
Sorry.
I haven't answered Paulo yet, I think.
Sorry, Paulo. Sorry, Michael.
Let me see. Can we speak about this kind of an experience without a deity? Yeah, we certainly can. Zen Buddhism does it all the time. And how does this refer to Nietzsche and Heidegger on the Augenblick? I'm not an expert on Heidegger, so I will I will decline to answer that and leave it up to experts on Heidegger. Nietzsche, yeah, I think the Dionysiac ecstasis would be at least part of the experience of cosmic consciousness, or that the oceanic experience that Hadot has, in the sense that it is a dropping of boundaries. And I think ultimately, perhaps the key feature of the cosmic consciousness / mystical experience is precisely the elimination of the boundary between subject and object. And part of my research right now, I mentioned the figure of Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who, by the way, has interesting works on Plotinus and meditation. Some of the findings of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics precisely lead to that same conclusion. People like Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, that the distinction between subject and object may really be more or less arbitrary.
Okay, now, yes, the second round of questions. Samuel Kimbrell.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. This was really a superb explication, I think. What I wanted to ask about is something that's been, I think, a slight misgiving that's been growing over the past two talks, which is one of the things I take to be really revolutionary in Hadot, and I think very much to the topic of this symposium specifically, which is the overlap with Foucault, is that he seems to unseat the possibility. When he's talking about spiritual exercises, it's precisely something that's not private. So there's a kind of political impetus in it, where our sort of familiar divisions between a public sphere and a private one seems to get deeply unseated in the way that he explicates the way that ancient philosophy works. And so I'd be really interested to hear you talk a little bit about how to kind of guard against the misreading that sees something like this as like just akin to kind of wellness practices, or a sort of lifestyle matter, you know, that you have like a large political system that works in the way that it does, and then you engage in sort of personal therapeutic activities on the side, something to that effect. Thank you.
Okay, Federico.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think that one of the points that I take from it, and this comparison or this parallel with this more neuroscientific approach, is that there's an aspect of universality in the notion of cosmic experience, and that relates to something I've been thinking, as a point I made elsewhere in my own work, which is about the sort of maybe underlying philosophical anthropology that Hadot seems to have. It seems to identify or to believe there are fundamental universal traces of human beings, of human reason in search of wisdom. I mentioned that in the previous comment. There's a point in Philosophy as a Way of Life, I don't remember exactly which text, is towards the end of the book, that he says that the ancient schools, they embody, they organize, they express fundamental traits, fundamental aspects of the human mind and of the human sort of way of being in the world. And that's why they're so important. There's something about them that is historical, but there's also something about them that reaches this universal aspects of human experience. And that's why they are so important for us. I know we have a view about that, so I'll stop here and want to hear more about it. But what I think is that, and I've made this point elsewhere, would like to know what you think about it. I think that the cosmic consciousness is also related to a fundamental sort of philosophical anthropology. Because at different points, for example, if you look at Ancient Man and Nature, for example, Hadot says that, you know, our relation to nature responds to the besoin de dépassement et d'infini dans le cœur de l'homme. So this idea that there's something in us that is fundamentally a will to go beyond, to exceed ourselves. Also in, I think, is the La figure des sages dans l'Antiquité gréco-latine, where he speaks about that the essence of man, the essence of human beings, is consisting to being beyond or above themselves, in a way, au-dessus de lui-même. So, yeah, would you say then that the cosmic experience relates to what we could call a philosophical anthropology in Hadot, and that is a universal trait, at least for Hadot? I'll stop here.
Anahid?
Yeah, thank you very much for this incredible presentation and very inspiring. And I think my question is actually in the line of Federico's one, because, well, I'm absolutely not an ancient philosopher. I work on contemporary philosophy and especially environmental philosophy. And I'm working on some communities, let's say eco-philosophical and agricultural communities. And there is something about practical philosophy and exercise of philosophy or exercise of spirituality, and something that's coming a lot is not necessarily about unity, like the cosmic feeling and the transformative liberation does not really pass not only by this feeling of unity, but by the feeling of relating with otherness. And so the feeling of like reaching some kind of transformative freedom really is linked to the idea of relationality. And I think that's slightly different because there is a focus is put it on the interdependencies and the fact that we relate, although if there is conflictuality. And I think it's different from unity, which is some kind of like a bigger integration of the self. And I wonder if Hadot said something about that, or is taking this idea or this nuance between relationality, the self as related to the other one, and the feeling of interdependencies, and the feeling that we're managing our relationship as a basis of moral autonomy, and so reaching our freedom this way, and the fact that we also can, we can reach some kind of cosmic consciousness. I hope it's clear. And I thank you if you can answer. I don't know if you can, but sorry if it's too far from your concern.
I'll try.
And thank you, Sent again.
I'll try. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marta, I think you're frozen.
think you're back,
Sorry,
Marta.
I think I'm experiencing some. Can you hear me?
Off and on.
Yeah.
I was giving the word to Matthew. I think I'm experiencing some internet troubles
All
this
right.
afternoon, unfortunately. Yeah, please.
Very quickly. Thank you, Professor Chase. Very wonderful presentation, really insightful. I was thinking, like, fittingly, very interestingly, actually for the theme of this symposium, an excessive emphasis granted exactly to this movement of interiorization, of concentration on the self, to the detriment of to this movement of exteriorization. Well, these two movements that you described in your presentation seems to be exactly what Hadot saw at work in Foucault's reading of ancient philosophy, especially when he writes in Philosophy as a Way of Life, something like what Foucault calls, I quote here very quickly, what Foucault calls practices of the self do indeed correspond for the Platonists and the Stoics to a movement of conversion to the self. But I do think, however, that this movement of interiorization is inseparably linked to another movement, whereby one raises to a higher psychic level, etc., etc. So I was thinking, could we say ultimately, considering your own considerations on this double movement, that Foucault interpretations of ancient philosophy in the end is not so much incorrect as incomplete? It just misses one of these two movements. Thank you.
Okay, now a final question by Ulrich Stegman.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. My question is coming from a very ill-informed view. I was just wondering if the general sense I got from the conference is that the spiritual exercises are really central to the ancients, for Hadot at least. But if that's the case, why is it that there's also the sense that I get that there were not the manuals developed that you get, for instance, in Buddhism, or all the hints at these particular practices seem to be very much distributed. You have bits and pieces, of course, in Aurelius and so on and so forth, but there's nothing, that seems comparable to the sort of systematic and intensive manuals or descriptions. Perhaps I'm totally misguided, and that may be true. I was just curious about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, Michael, you have the word again.
Okay, so I will carry out the miraculous feat of answering 6 questions in 1 minute. In real life, I will begin with Ulrich. I think the last question. Why no manuals? I don't know. The way that Greek in particular, but also ancient Latin writings were preserved and transmitted, which ones were preserved and which were transmitted, as far as I know, is pretty much unexplained. We don't know. Why was there only one manuscript of Marcus Aurelius's works? We don't know. It does look as though there were treatises on spiritual exercises in antiquity, and they just don't happen to have survived. So I'm afraid I don't have a better answer than that. I want to point out, though, that when you mentioned Buddhist manuals, one thing that I think is worth emphasizing, and it was striking when I talked to my students in Japan, they said, well, all these spiritual exercises, yeah, fine, but don't the Greeks talk about the body? Why don't they have breathing exercises? And I didn't have an answer to that, but I do think that it's an excellent question. And I hope to work on that in the future. Okay, Matteo, thanks so much for your comments. That's just absolutely, I think that's a very, very fruitful observation. And I'm going to take that ball and run with it, if I may, with proper acknowledgement, of course. But I think you might be onto something very, very, very interesting indeed. Thank you. Anahita, I am very interested in ecology myself, and I'm interested to see that in some ecological movements, at least, Pierre Hadot's writings are taken quite seriously. I think that the notion of relationality as clear would be important both on the way up in the, if we can speak of the, let's speak in Neoplatonic terms and speak about on the one hand an ascent up to unity, an experience of unity. It would be the experience of interrelationality would be key to helping us set out on this path, to being guided by colleagues, students, and teachers towards it. And once we're up there, because we have to come back down, as Plato taught us in the allegory of the cave, then of course relationality becomes key once again when we go back and deal with our fellow human beings, presumably, especially in Buddhism, on the grounds, on the basis of a newly found compassion and solidarity with not just with all human beings, but with all living things. That would be ideal in an ideal situation, I think. I'm not sure that that's a satisfactory answer, but it's as good as I can do for the moment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's already a starting track to nurture the thoughts.
Great, I'm glad. Federico, Hadot's philosophical anthropology, right, and here, as often, it's so hard to determine which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Here, once again, the case of James Austin, I think, is similar. James Austin had an experience of Kensho, and then spent the next 30, 40 years carrying out neurophysiological studies to try to explain it in neurophysiological terms. I suspect that something similar might have happened to Pierre Hadot. He had these early mystical experiences, oceanic experiences, which he tells us about in his autobiographical works, and then he set out looking for ancient writings that would inform him about what kind of experience that was. That's what directed him and sent him to study Plotinus under Paul Henri at the Sorbonne. So yeah, now to what extent is his philosophical anthropology, as you call it, conditioned by his initial experience? Well, I think he was only interested in those philosophically anthropological doctrines which would help him make sense of his own experiences, basically. What went on? What happened in that experience? And you speak about this drive to transcend oneself. Yeah, that's a very important consideration for Hadot, and he points out its paradoxicality. Right, that in people like Aristotle, for instance, for Aristotle, in the Metaphysics and the Nicomachean Ethics, the moment when we experience our greatest fulfillment is when we are participating in the life of the gods, basically the life of the intellect as it intelligizes itself. And the daimon is a similar concept in that on the one hand it's immanent within us, but since it's a fragment of Zeus, it's also transcendent. So for this is Hadot, never always refers to these as paradoxical aspects of the human situation, that in one sense that which we are most deeply is at the same time above and beyond us. But so I'm not sure that he ever got closer to a solution than just stating the existence of this paradox. And finally, Samuel, you mentioned that spiritual exercises are not private. Well, I don't agree. I don't think Hadot either. They were often private. The reading can be private, wasn't always, could be read in public, but many of the spiritual exercises in question can be carried out private. And in fact, people like Epictetus order his students, go out for a walk, go walk by yourself, think about these things all by yourself. And that's how you're going to assimilate your doctrines. So I think that the public nature of spiritual exercises, some of them are public, some of them are private, and I'm not sure how important that debate really is, and I'm not sure. I tend to think that Foucault exaggerates the importance of the parrhesiastical, because he was looking for a justification for his own philosophy, which was basically speak truth to power. But I'm not sure how really it's an element in ancient Greek spiritual exercises, but whether it was an absolutely crucial element, I'm not so sure.